Hey, everybody. Welcome to Conspiracy the Show. I'm your host, Adam Todd Brown. Joining me as co-host today, my favorite co-host of all, no co-host. But I do have a very special guest. Comedian Kym Kral is here. Kym, how's it going?
Hi, I'm excited. I'm nervous, though, too.
I am super excited for this.
This is like my one opinion that stops every conversation once I bring it up, clears rooms. Men have ghosted me. Like, this is my one opinion that, it might be my one weird thing.
Yeah, I mean, the whole reason we're doing this is because you were on an episode of the Unpops podcast not too long ago, and you said the name Paul McCartney and then threw up some air quotes.
I did do that. I do that.
Which did actually kind of stop the podcast in its tracks, so we could ask what the air quotes were about. And you think Paul McCartney died in the 1960s, right?
A lot of people think Paul McCartney died in the 1960s.
That's true. And we're doing kind of a format buster here today. Normally, I bring all the research, I do all the legwork, and I relay the conspiracy to the co-host or the guest and the audience. And, they decide. Going the other way this time. Kym is going to tell me why it is true that Paul McCartney died in 1966, I think?
1966, November 9th, 1966.
9/11.
No, November 9th. 11/9.
Yeah, I suppose.
But I guess in
England, though.
It's a 9/11. Oh,
yeah.
My God.
Yeah, so Paul McCartney died on 9/11. Go on.
Okay, so the story is, and I watched a documentary yesterday, too, in between power outages, that made me kind of believe it more, even though they called the replacement a different name, but the full name. Okay, so basically in 1966, around midnight, November 9th, 1966, the Beatles go into recording, and Paul and John get in a fight over lyrics, right? Mm-hmm. They get in a big fight over lyrics. Paul gets increasingly flustered, upset, so he leaves. And he dies. He gets a big car accident and basically gets decapitated, right? And so there's two stories. So the story I knew before, and then the story from the documentary, because the story from the documentary, and I'm kind of using air quotes because I don't feel like they could make a documentary, call it a documentary. How many times can I say the word documentary?
I know, it's really, I don't even think it's a real word anymore.
Take a drink every time I do. It's 9 a.m. But the story is that, the manager, they saw it was Paul McCartney, and it was you have to understand, at the time in 1966, Beatlemania was at its height. Mm-hmm. It was people would have killed themselves had someone like him died, right? Also, England was buzzing because they won the World Cup. So go on a ride with me. They're like, fuck, we have right? So the manager, the documentary, okay, take a drink. The documentary says that someone from MI5 contacted the remaining Beatles, found them. And this, by the way, this is set up as it's George Harrison's last will and testament. And this whole documentary is set up around the fact that that the MI5 was going to kill the Beatles if they came forward with this Billy Shears thing. So,
is that the documentary you're talking about, the one with the George Harrison audio?
Yes, but it's not him. If you go to IMDb,
yeah, it's like that's like a mockumentary. I don't think that's like a real documentary. I watched that 10 years ago.
Was it called Paul is Really Dead? We're going to look this up. How do you know if it's a documentary? What if we derail? By the way, I thought this was real before I watched this documentary, but wait, it's not okay, where does it say mockumentary?
I feel like that's a spoof, but I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Go on. I don't.
All right, we're going to keep going. I don't think it's a spoof. Either way, the podcast isn't over because this is how I felt before I watched this thing. So basically, they had held a Paul McCartney look-alike contest randomly. So they held this random Tiger Beat, something like that. And this Scottish orphan named Billy Shears won. So they contact Billy Shears. And they basically, the plan was only like a week or so. Let's just like, this happened so suddenly. Let's like give ourselves some time so we don't have to announce like possibly one of the most tragic deaths ever, right? Not really, but especially in that time, how crazy Beatlemania was. So the plan was, and then Billy Shears wasn't really that bad. The thing is, though, he's a right-handed guitar player. Okay, I'm just going to read the notes now. You ready for this?
That's the thing. For the Beatles to have put a replacement Paul McCartney in place and recorded the music they recorded, they needed way more than a lookalike. Like,
no, and that's the other thing, though. Right before Paul McCartney died, they had announced that they were changing their look and stopping touring. They decided to stop touring just randomly before that. So they were able to, like, take some time because they're like, we're changing our sound. And that's when Sgt. Pepper came out, which was like a whole other... And that album cover is basically a funeral to Paul.
That album cover has a lot of references to death on it. And if you're looking for references to Paul McCartney's death, you'll find a lot of references to death on that album cover, but you'll also find references to death in literally everything. And that thing you just said about them changing their look and their sound and their style, is that maybe what they're throwing the funeral for? Is the old version of the Beatles?
No.
Are you sure?
Yes, because why wouldn't they just say that?
Because that's boring. Like, why would they say that? Why would they say this album cover represents the death of the old Beatles, baby? Like, we knew. Like, you knew that looking at it, that represented a different version of the Beatles.
But it also could possibly be that there's a bunch of references to Paul dying.
It could be, but I am not in any way, shape, or form convinced.
At all?
No.
Okay, this is how
Here's the thing.
I feel.
Paul McCartney was young in 1966, and I've looked at the evidence, and for one thing, a lot of the evidence is made up. Like, all the stuff from the Abbey Road album, the person who put that out into the world has since made it clear that he was joking, and that it's not, like, he didn't really intend people to take that as facts.
Like the 28, and how it was like a funeral. Like, okay, well, the weird thing is about after all that, Paul is different in every album cover. Like all the original Beatles, the 3 original alive Beatles. And don't get me wrong, I think, okay, the way I really think about this is, if 5 or 10 years from now, Paul McCartney was like, hey, I'm really Billy Shears, that whole thing was real, it wouldn't matter, because he's been Paul McCartney. Like, Paul McCartney number 2 has been Paul McCartney longer than Paul McCartney number 1 was. So he's basically Paul McCartney. So if he came forward and was like, I'm actually this, but I'm still Paul McCartney, I would be like, I'm not surprised. But if you know,
well, that's the whole thing. That's the whole thing. With any good conspiracy theory, a really important question to ask is why? Like, why would this be such a big deal? And you mentioned, well, the Beatles were so huge in 1966, and people would have been all upset if
devastated.
Right, but 4 years later they weren't? Like, the Beatles broke up 4 years later.
Yeah. And they say the reason why they actually broke up was because the new Paul McCartney and John couldn't get along, and John wouldn't quit making all these references on the album cover. Do you think I'm crazy?
I don't think you're crazy, but I think you need to at least take into account that John Lennon might have been fucking with you.
No.
Like, the Beatles knew of this rumor. Like, Paul McCartney was interviewed about it in Life magazine, because after the rumor started spreading, Life magazine went to his fucking farm.
They also broke into his farm.
Yeah.
And they actually broke into the farm in Scotland, where Billy Shears is from.
Now, if you
And he was angry and was like, fine, come in here and take these pictures, whatever, we'll do the interview. Because they were like, we got a bunch of pictures of you that you don't want out there, but if you give us an interview. Like, I don't think it was a scheduled interview. I think they just...
No, they just showed up at his place.
Yeah.
Which is what you do if there's a rumor that a fake Paul McCartney is out there in the world. You don't call and say, hey, can we talk to this fake Paul McCartney? You show up like Jesse Ventura.
But he's like Paul McCartney at this point, right? Like, he's like, at that point...
Or is he Billy Shears?
Billy Shears died. Billy Shears died when the real Paul McCartney died.
Okay.
Meaning, like, that guy took on, and then that's what the maybe documentary that it doesn't say mockumentary anywhere. It has to say that if it's a mockumentary.
Okay, so what does the documentary say? Does it mention that Life magazine interview?
Yes.
And is that it? Let me guess. That's just part of the plot, right?
No, they mentioned it so briefly. I only know about that from other research I've done.
Okay, because that does seem pretty important that like actual journalists went out to Paul McCartney at the time this rumor was circulating.
Well, let me
and
ask
they were
you,
like, here he is.
But if he's there, they're a look-alike. There's plastic surgery. That's what the documentary said. They're like, the reason why MI5 was so invested is that they were like, we don't want to have mass hysteria on our hands. We'll give this guy minor plastic surgery, right? And so it was like, we've used so much of the government resources. Now it sounds really crazy as I'm saying it out loud. That like, you can't expose us because we shouldn't tell the world we're using government resources to like fake a beetle. But let me ask you, if the journalists go to the farm, and it is, in my world, it is a fake Paul McCartney. Just pretend it is, right? Pretend we know it is. He's not, they're not going to go there and be like, are you fake Paul McCartney? And he's not going to, like, this is like a well-developed lie. And at this point, this is like a full-blown life. You know what I mean? So, like, they're going to show up and he's not going to be like, you got me with my pants down. You know, like, he's going to be like, yeah, I'm Paul McCartney. Because he's had to be Paul McCartney all the time.
It wasn't that long into it, though.
But it's not like somebody, like, I'm not famous like that, right?
Uh-huh.
Someday. I leaned into my microphone. You can't see it because of the thing. But so, like, if someone, like, if they decided to replace me instead of just letting me die, whoever replaced me could, like, be themselves most of the time. Paul McCartney was like in the spotlight. So Billy Shears so maybe it wasn't that long into the rumor, but it went on for a couple of years before people started taking it seriously. And it started in the States.
Well, yeah, it started with an article in a college newspaper.
Yeah.
Where it was just someone like asking about it. But
why did they ask about it? I couldn't find, like, why did this person...
Well, that's the thing. The actual origin of this rumor is kind of unknown. And the only genesis of it that we know is the articles that start talking about it, where, like, it was covered in a Beatles fan magazine where they were like, no, fucking Paul is not dead. It was covered in a couple college newspapers. It was covered on a radio show. But no one knows exactly where the rumor started. I don't know which version of the crash you believe, because he was killed in a car crash.
Yeah.
And the version I've always heard is that he picked up a hitchhiker.
Named Rita.
Oh, is that lovely Rita Meter maid? Let me guess.
Maybe.
Oh, here's the thing.
But yeah, her name was Rita. They actually changed all of her information. She came back and was like, hey, I've decided I would like money or something for keeping.
Well, no, she died. The version I've always heard is the girl he picked up died in the car crash too.
Oh, I heard she didn't die.
And the version I've always heard is she gets in the car and sees that it's Paul McCartney that picked her up. And she's so excited, she freaks out and hugs him. And they both die in a car crash, which raises the question, who witnessed her freaking out and grabbing his neck? If it was just...
Yeah, I always knew I thought she lived.
Well, tell me about her then.
Okay, so I heard she lived. So M13, this guy Maxwell goes and gets the remaining Beatles at their recording studio. You can't make that face at me.
Is this the Maxwell referenced in Maxwell's Silver Hammer? I love how all of these people have names that match Beatles songs. Here's the thing.
Eleanor Rigby is apparently about Paul's...
Here's the thing. Here's the thing.
There.
Wait, here's the thing. MI6 and the CIA both are brutal intelligence agencies. If John Lennon was intentionally putting clues to an MI6 plot on a Beatles album, they would fucking kill him.
I'm sorry, where is John Lennon now?
Yeah, he died in 1980. You think they killed him in 1980 for putting clues to Beatles conspiracies on their albums?
I don't think the clues were very
People were talking about the clues when the albums were out. Like it was in the 60s. Yes. Like the article you're referencing where it all started in the United States, that was like 68.
Oh yeah, I know that. But like the reason why they say, I mean, I don't know much about John Lennon's death, and that makes me really sad because I don't want to know why that guy did it. But like a lot of the articles are saying it's because, or not a lot, but a few of the articles are saying, now I understand how crazy I sound, by the way. I understand. I'm just saying,
here's the thing.
One of the small ones that I'm like, maybe.
I don't doubt there might have been some intelligence agency involvement in the death of John Lennon. But if there was, it has nothing to do with clues in Beatles. Because think of what you just said.
No, he was going to go to the documentary, mockumentary, whatever it was like, no, he called George Harrison. It was like, enough's enough. I can't live with this lie anymore. It's been enough time. I'm going to move to the States and I'm going to come out with it. Or he moved to the States and then he's like, I'm going to come out with it finally. And George Harrison was never, so this is another weird thing. Okay, real quick. George Harrison spent most of his time in his castle and after this, because he was like, I was so scared to leave because of all of this. And number two, when they were inducted into the Hall of Fame, Paul McCartney didn't go. And George Harrison was like, yeah, he wasn't a part of that. So it's fine. Like there was an interview of George Harrison, actual George Harrison, his face. He didn't say he was a part of that, but he goes, yeah, he wasn't there. And they're like, don't you find that weird? And he's like, no, we had a good time without him.
They didn't get along. Like they weren't like, not every member of Creedence Clearwater Revival showed up when they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It doesn't mean John Fogerty faked his death in the 1960s. It just means they fucking hated each other by the 80s. Like there's TV miniseries about how much John and Paul fucking hated each other. There's nothing about Paul McCartney not showing up for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony that leads me to believe he died in a car crash in the 60s.
In 1966.
Okay, so tell me some of the other clues. Tell me about some of the other proof.
Well, it was mostly about the album stuff, but you sort of debunked that right away. So do you want me to just read it?
Well, can you run us through some of the clues on the album cover?
Yes. All right, so let's start.
Because I did read about a bunch of these, and I have thoughts on some of them if you get to those.
Okay. Let's see. A group of reporters broke into. All right. The rumors died. The rumors died after the reporters broke in and found, in the Lifetime magazine. The rumors died shortly after that. And they felt that the Beatles were Okay. So then the reason why they're saying that they did the clues on the album was because the Beatles were racked with guilt about their friend dying and how they just sort of continued on. Okay. So Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band. I always said Club Am as a kid. Okay. Like Club Am. It depicted Paul's funeral. The cover centers around Paul, who is wearing a page that said a patch that says OPD, officially pronounced dead. It's actually Ontario Police Department.
Yeah. I think Ontario Provincial. Something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
It says Providal on my notes, but I don't think that's a word. On the back cover, George is pointing to a line that says Wednesday at 5:00 because that is when Paul was officially pronounced dead. And weirdly enough, November 9th, 1966 was a Wednesday, and he died at 5 a.m. on Wednesday. Why is he pointing at that? Do you have the Sgt. Pepper Lonely Heart Club Band? Do you want me to get the album out?
No, I know. I'm familiar with the album cover, and I've heard about these clues. But again, that's like saying, why did John say the walrus was Paul? Because he's fucking with you. Like the Beatles knew about these rumors by this point.
Yeah, but they seemed mad about it in interviews. Like when you asked Paul was like, no, I'm alive. Why at first he was like...
How would you feel if people, every time you sat down for an interview, were like, hey, can I compare your ears to this old picture of you and see if it's really you? Of course you'd be mad.
I don't know. I think it was kind of funny.
Well, they obviously did think it was kind of funny. That's why they put all those clues on the Sgt. Pepper album cover.
You think that they had, okay, so then Paul is the only one who has his back turned on the album. There are also dozens of other symbols for death in other cultures, but there was like literally dozens, and I didn't understand most of them. It was like, well, in Italy they do this, so this is why they did this. Like,
well, one of the things people point to is everyone else is wearing red and Paul is wearing blue. Yeah. Why wouldn't Paul be the one covered in blood?
Because the guilt is on their hands. The blood is on their hands.
Yeah, they really felt guilty about this. That's for Dan. Point to me where they feel guilty.
Well, they can't feel guilty because if they feel guilty, then they come forward and then they prove that this is. Then they can't show guilt. So that's what the album cover is just like clues because they feel guilty. This is the longest I've ever talked about this, and I honestly thought I had way more evidence because most of the time, like, I have a whole, 2 pages written out, but most of the time no one ever lets me get this far, and they either leave or they don't. They don't allow me to go in circles. You don't think that there's at all a possibility? Why would this rumor start?
I mean, rumors like this start all the time. There's a rumor like this about Avril Lavigne.
Yeah, that one might be real, too.
That one is absolutely not real. Here's the thing about the Beatles. I don't buy the mass hysteria argument. I don't think the British government would go to these lengths to cover up the death of a pop star. Like, people die. Like, people die all the time. And the thing about the Beatles is they're the Beatles. Like, they didn't really need another Paul McCartney. They had a John Lennon and a George Harrison in the group already.
Paul McCartney was one of the main ones. Like, he was.
They have the Beatles are 3 people. The Beatles are John Lennon, George Harrison, and Paul McCartney. Like, they are the 3 primary singer-songwriters.
Poor Ringo.
But do you honestly think if that was a fake Paul McCartney, he would have that much swagger within the group? Like, do you think a band that had been together since they were kids would let a fake Paul McCartney come in and essentially run the band? Because at that point in history, Paul McCartney does kind of, after Brian Epstein, I think Brian Epstein died back in the 60s, but after they lose their manager, Paul McCartney does step in for a while and kind of assume the managerial role within the band. Why would they let an imposter do that?
Okay, 2 things with that. One of the conspiracies, it was Brian Epstein that actually orchestrated this whole thing and was like, we're only going to do a placeholder for a few days just to figure out what to do. 2, one of the things is John, when they were talking about replacing him, John was like, I have enough songs and music that Paul and I wrote together that we haven't presented to the group that I can keep the John Paul writing thing going on albums for at least 50 more songs. Like, I have enough material that I can keep this going. 2, you only know what we saw, right? So it's like, Paul was sort of the lead guy before he died. Like, him and John were the lead people before he died. So in order to keep the thing up, they'd have to show, at least to the world, but John was in charge. I think John was in charge of the whole thing.
Okay. But history begs to differ. Like, Paul McCartney did take on a bunch of managerial duties within the Beatles after he is alleged to have died. And I don't think the Beatles would have gone for that. Like,
but it could have just been for show is what I'm saying. Like,
okay, so who was their manager then?
I don't know.
It was John Lennon, but they were having Paul McCartney pretend to do it?
He was the manager?
They didn't have, after Brian Epstein died, they didn't have a manager for a while. So
you get this mad every time?
Someone had to step in and assume that role. And for a long time, Paul McCartney was that person in the Beatles who assumed that role. And there's also, you mentioned John Lennon saying, well, I have enough songs for another 50 songs.
Uh-huh.
John Lennon and Paul McCartney had very, 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 very different writing styles.
Yeah, but he had enough of his, like, they wrote enough songs.
Okay.
Like, I have enough material. I just Googled it.
Okay,
Hold on.
so now the conspiracy isn't that they happen to find a perfect lookalike with the same musical chops as Paul McCartney. Now it's they just needed the lookalike, and John Lennon wrote the music.
Well, I'm sure Billy Shears helped. He was a musician. He was a right-handed guitar player.
Okay, have you ever learned to play guitar?
No.
You cannot switch from playing right-hand guitar to left-hand guitar in the amount of time it would have been necessary for Billy Shears to do that.
Well, they weren't playing live, so it's not when they were doing it.
They played live on the rooftop during the Let It Be sessions. Who was playing?
What year was that?
That was 1969.
Oh, no.
I mean, you are right that they stopped touring, but...
Oh, no. But also, real quick, your manager question. The manager, Alan Klein, took over the Beatles' business affairs in 1969 following the death of Brian Epstein.
Yeah, it's one of the things that broke the Beatles up, because Brian Epstein died, Paul McCartney starts assuming kind of a managerial role, and then John Lennon brings in that guy who was the Rolling Stones manager. And that is actually kind of the last nail in the coffin for the Beatles. So it was them disagreeing on business decisions. And I still just don't think they would have let an imposter have that much weight in those business decisions. I also, if this involved the government, I still see no world where they would let the Beatles put all of these hints about this plot out to the public.
But they aren't that obvious. They also said in a documentary that the guy, Maxwell, called and was like, you guys have to stop doing this. And then that's when the White Album came out, where it was just the White Album, but inside there were some clues. Also, the theory is John was going crazy, and that's why he was doing that, and they were hoping they were going to get away with it. George was like, this is scary. That's why he made those tapes that they tried to bear. I think it was a documentary, not a mockumentary, because they were like, look, we tried to authenticate these.
But it's not really George Harrison on the tapes.
No. But I think that's for movie purposes, right?
So you think someone heard the tapes and then re-recorded them in their best George Harrison voice?
Yes.
Why?
But for like the movie.
Why wouldn't you just play the tapes in the movie?
I don't know. I want you to know that I understand that there are a lot of holes in this.
I have always felt there were a lot of holes in the Paul is dead theory.
I just don't know where it would come from. That's the only thing that I'm like, how could this type of rumor get so much traction? Back then there's no internet. You know what I mean? There's no internet. The only thing we really have is like magazines and newspapers. And like, I just don't understand where this could have, some college kid was just like, oh, I think.
I mean, it started as a rumor, but like rumors, Paul McCartney was involved in a car accident in 1966.
On November 9th?
I don't think it was on November 9th, but he was involved in a perfectly well-publicized car accident and sustained some minor injuries. The same thing happened with Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan had a mysterious motorcycle crash that like no one talked about. Like they knew it happened, but there were no details.
Two things. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
One, the rumor about Bob Dylan is that wasn't a real car wreck. It was just a way to get him into rehab.
Oh, it could be.
And then the second one, what if they did what if they well publicized this big car wreck so they could explain some of the scars on Paul McCartney?
What if he just got scars in a car accident?
Well, no, he was decapitated in that car accident. There's also rumors that he blew his own head off in that act. Like he actually.
Yeah, he blew his mind out in a car.
Yeah.
He didn't notice that the light had changed. That's a line from A Day in the Life by
No, I
the
know. I
Beatles.
just didn't expect you to know so much. I thought I was just going to explain it all, and then you were going to be like, cool, but you're like, no. I guess I didn't know that you'd...
I know a lot about the Beatles. I'm a big Beatles fan. I read, when the Beatles put out that anthology book, like the huge coffee table size one, I read that shit in 3 days. I like the Beatles a lot, and I know a lot about them. And I've seen all of these clues, and they're all things... It reminds me of that conspiracy where people are like, oh, Stanley Kubrick hides a bunch of Illuminati symbols in his movies. Sure.
Oh,
he hides, for one thing, he doesn't hide any of that shit. They're just there. And they are occult symbols. And occult symbology is prevalent in art all throughout history. It doesn't mean Stanley Kubrick is shouting out the Illuminati. And the genesis of that conspiracy theory is a comedy article that popped up on the internet in 1995, I think. And every example of that conspiracy since leaves that part out. No one ever mentions, oh, well, the first person to bring this up was joking. Like, that part always gets left out. And that's kind of the case with the Beatles too. Like, not so much with the Sgt. Pepper stuff, but all of the Abbey Road stuff. Because then you say, well, Maxwell called him and said, hey, I'm going to drop my silver hammer on you if you don't stop putting these clues on your album covers. Well, then explain Abbey Road. That comes out after the White Album, and that's got a ton of alleged clues.
Well, they did this... the baby and Meat album, you know, where they have the doll heads.
Yeah, the Butcher cover. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's not that was the original cover, and now the one to the public is Paul in a box. That's when they said Maxwell called and says, "What are you doing? You can't do this anymore." And John was like, "Okay, we'll do this."
Well, I know the Beatles got a phone call over that Butcher cover, but I think that's because
you don't think it was it's MI6, not MI5. It might have been a mockumentary. They called it MI5.
There's MI5 and MI6 are both.
Okay, they called it MI5.
British intelligence agencies. But the thing about the Butcher cover, think about the Beatles' demographic at that time. It's like teen girls. Like, they're the first like legitimate boy band. And I think the reason they were forced to change that cover is because that is a shocking look to put out to a bunch of teenage girls. You sitting around with meat cleavers and bloody doll parts. Like, I think that's why it was changed. Also, didn't that album come out before 1966?
What's it called? What's the album called?
I think that's Yesterday and Today, but I'm not positive.
Baby parts Beatle album. This is how I
Google Beatles Butcher cover. It is Yesterday and Today. And it came out in June 1966. That blows up the theory a little bit, huh?
Oh my God. How can you just make a documentary and not have any facts in there? I spent $4 renting this thing / I bought it. I just decided to buy it because I was like...
You're going to want to watch it multiple times, obviously.
Yeah, I was like, well, renting it is $2 and buying it is $5. Why wouldn't I just buy it?
You can't afford not to buy it.
You have to buy it.
At that price.
All right, what about this? Okay, this is another thing I had. In 1968, an unknown artist named Terry Knight spent a lot of time with what would have been the replacement Paul. When Paul McCartney wanted to sign Terry to their record company, Apple, which, by the way, it was supposed to be a Paul. It was a Paul. They were doing like a thing with Paul. Never mind. I forgot what it was called. But
Nevermind was a Nirvana album.
What?
Nothing. Go on.
Okay, so when Paul McCartney wanted to sign Terry to their record company, Apple, he wrote a song called Saint Paul, which people said he was alluding to Paul being dead. Or some think it was a reference to the Beatles being close to Jesus because of what John had said earlier. But then I listened to the song and I thought it was more creepy homage to Paul instead of evidence that Terry knew that it was a fake Paul. I listened to it. It was just more Do you know what song I'm talking about?
Yeah, and what I've always heard about the song is that, because again, we've talked about how at that point in Beatles history, there were a lot of business differences more than creative differences. Like their music, like they were still fine when they were sitting around recording songs the way they recorded songs, which was also very unique and not a thing I think you could just slip an imposter into, but it's fine. But they had a lot of business differences. And what I've always heard about this song is that this guy was close enough to the Beatles at the time that he saw a lot of those arguments and disagreements and mostly sided with Paul McCartney. And that's what that song is about, is him saying, hey, when it comes to all this internal shit with the Beatles, Paul is actually right. As opposed to, hey, Paul is dead and in heaven right now. Because also that guy, if we're talking MI5, MI6, that guy gets murdered in the recording studio. Like that song
immediately
would never come out if that's what that was about.
Well, this was this. Okay. The song released in April 1969, months after the rumor, the dead Paul rumor started. The publishing company took notice and re-released the single to give credit to John and Paul because there were so many Hey Jude references. Publish it, and it made sense. Publish it correctly, and the royalties are handled properly. But also, there was a weird thing too that I read about it was in the documentary. I just didn't want to admit that I got that too from the documentary because I'm starting to rethink. I can't believe I spent $5 on that. No regrets. I'll probably watch it a few more times. So publish it correctly, and then they can handle out the royalties correctly, right? Mm-hmm. What people think is that the fake Paul commissioned Terry to write the song to tell people the truth, and when the song wasn't a hit, they just changed up the publishing stuff just to make the royalties easier. The song isn't proof, but it's definitely where most people think the original conspiracy started. The original conspiracy started in the Detroit area, and that is where Terry was from. And Terry died in 2004 and never gave a single interview on the subject. That's kind of weird. Wouldn't he just be like, yeah, that was Paul McCartney. Why are we still... Why is no one just being like, why is Paul McCartney not just going, look, I'm Paul McCartney. I know these rumors are still going
Paul
around.
McCartney addressed it on Saturday Night Live.
But not really. He did, but it was like, ha ha ha, tongue in cheek, I'm really Paul McCartney.
I mean, how many times does Paul McCartney have to say he's Paul McCartney?
Has he submitted a DNA test?
He doesn't have to.
Well, no one has to do that unless it's a criminal thing, but...
If I was him, I wouldn't.
I would.
Why? To get people to stop talking? Talk. Who cares?
Yeah. And there is one reason also, if he submitted to a DNA test, I would believe it.
What if it came back and said he's 100% that bitch?
Well, I mean, we both know that all of my thoughts on this aren't grounded in complete facts. So I'd probably be bummed for a few days, but then I would move on. It'd be the same if it came out and it said, Paul McCartney's not really Paul McCartney. Also, Paul McCartney and I have the same birthday, so that would really bum me out because I don't have the same birthday as Billy Shears. I don't know when that guy's birthday is, but...
Also, so who wrote all the Wings songs? And all the
band that Paul was in at some point.
Mm-hmm. And all his solo records. Who wrote?
Yeah, probably him. I mean, this guy is a musician. When they found him, he's a musician. That's the thing that they're like, yeah, he actually was a pretty good musician. The only thing that was weird is that he had the wrong, and the sound is different, and Paul's sound is different from between the accidents. Even though, yes, they announced they were going to make their sound different.
Here's the thing. One of the things people say about conspiracy theories, especially the more outlandish ones, and why people believe them and why they spread, is people are looking for an explanation to things that seem unexplainable.
Like what? How is this? There's nothing in this.
There's not. Look at the Beatles pre-Sgt. Pepper and post-Sgt. Pepper. That is a jarring change, even though their music was heading in that direction. Rubber Soul and Revolver are way different than Please Please Me and these albums where they were playing R&B covers and I Want to Hold Your Hand and shit. Once they hit Revolver and Rubber Soul, their music starts getting weirder. That's when they start like fucking with the sitar, taking acid. Like, that's the thing. The Beatles started taking drugs. That's why Sgt. Pepper looks the way it does. It's not because anyone died. But I think that change alienated a lot of people. It had to. Like, people who were expecting them to show up in matching suits and go, whoo! Once Sgt. Pepper...
think that's where it started, the rumor? Somebody made a rumor one of them must have died?
Yeah.
That's a wild thing to jump from. Because really, before I knew this...
It's a wild... Why would that be so wild?
That one of them died and was replaced by an imposter? That's a crazy thing to make up.
Why are you yelling at me? I didn't make it up.
I'm not yelling.
But someone made it up, and I think that's what it is. I think people were trying to rationalize this metamorphosis the Beatles went through at that point.
They were kids. They got a bunch of fame, and then they were like cool kids too, you know? So they were like, we're making all this money by being essentially a boy band, and we want to be real artists. That's what all artists go through, right? They like get all their money from the
fans,
and then they change.
Fans don't like change. There is a pretty famous video of Beatles fans watching the video for Strawberry Fields for the first time. It's like a live studio audience, and everyone is so fired up to watch it. And then they see that crazy ass video, and it cuts back to that audience, and they're like, okay.
I think I've seen that video.
And they interview people, and some of them are like, yeah, man, I think it's pretty cool. And there's others who are like, I'm gonna cry. Like, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. Like, the Beatles changed. They changed. Yeah. And it makes pointing to their music at the time as proof of a death conspiracy very easy. Because a lot of things in the Beatles were changing and dying at the time. And that was coming through in their work.
I've dedicated a lot of time to believing this. Why did this rumor start? And how is it like, it's just weird.
I'm telling you, it's because the Beatles changed so much. And people want a change. They want an explanation for that change that goes beyond, well, people change sometimes. But people don't want that. They want there to be some extenuating circumstance that has made the band that was their favorite band that sounded one way and looked one way, now they sound a whole different way and look a whole different way. And why? Why did this happen? Why did this happen to me? And eventually some idiot landed on, you know, when they said Paul McCartney had a car accident in 1966, I bet he died. And that's why the Beatles had to change so much. Never mind the fact that they were writing a bunch of the Sgt. Pepper stuff before his alleged death date. Like that, you know.
Well, that's the thing that they're saying, though, too, is that those songs were already written. Like, John was like, I already have a lot of material that Paul and I did together.
It means
what about
nothing.
Eleanor Rigby? They said that song is about Paul's funeral. Like, the preacher says a sermon that no one will hear.
Eleanor Rigby is on the Revolver album. When did that came out before Sgt. Pepper?
I think that came out before or after he died, at least. I think it, what year did the Revolver album come out? 1966.
Uh-huh. Wait. What month?
Oh no.
See? That would have come.
How can they just make this documentary, call it a documentary, and then just put it out there into the world? What if we don't end this with me saying, you've convinced me, but we end this with both of us saying that we could both maybe possibly be right?
Oh, I know I'm right.
I won't say that you've convinced me, but you have disappointed me.
I feel like I have secretly convinced you, but you don't have to admit it. It's fine. No worries.
It's just, I liked that part of my personality.
The part that thought Paul McCartney died in the 60s. I will be honest, it is probably your defining characteristic.
It's the only thing people know about me. I've done all the research I can. And every time it comes back to, but it's just a weird thing to make up. All right, I'm not going to say I have been convinced otherwise, but I'm going to say I inched the other way a few inches.
Well, good. So, Kym, thank you so much for doing the episode, especially on such short notice. Do you have anything to plug before we get out of here?
Yeah, I have a book and a podcast. I wrote a book about my dating life called Confessions of a Recovering Party Girl and how much I used to drink. So drinking and dating. And then I have a podcast called Kral Space, Kym Kral, KYMKRAL space. Yeah.
Do I have anything to plug? AdamToddBrown.substack.com. Things are heating up over there. That's where I write. You can give me money to write. Although everything on there is free for right now, but that's going to change very soon. Other than that, that's all I got. And I think that's it. We should get out of here. Kym, say goodbye.
Adam. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Goodbye, everybody. We love you.